hot bug, and that means one thing. Oh, that's a big one. Dude, he crunked it. That's the way you do it. Look how he chomped that thing. Spring is here, and honestly, if it's not by you, I promise you it's coming. Warm weather, and probably one of the best times of the year to fish for bass. They spawn, they get shallow, and we catch bigs and a bunch of them. I'm absolutely fired up about it. So I figured it'd be a good time to talk about a technique that I've been learning, and that's skipping chatterbaits. We all talk about skipping jigs because frankly, these fish want to go shallow, they want to stage, they want to use cover and get in that skinny water to do their thing, their spring thing, their spawn. And a great way to catch these fish is to target that cover, but they see a lot of jigs. It's pretty easy to skip like a flipping jig or a swim jig under kind of overhanging trees, docks like this one behind me, or any kind of cover like that because they're using it. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to skip a chatterbait, and then we're going to talk about the exact equipment that you need because you're putting the bait in a very small space, and that means you need specific equipment in order to present that bait correctly, whether it's rods, reels, lines, lures, presentations, because that tiny space is where the bass live, so you got to put your bait there. So let's start with how to do it. So what's the process when you're actually skipping a chatterbait? Well, basically, I like to use a little bit lighter chatterbait as we talked about, and you're going to use kind of a roll cast. We got a dock right here. I'm going to look for, do you guys see how those shade lines are kind of contoured out and they square out from the dock? That changes throughout the day, but bass like that kind of a low light period. But all you're going to do is make like a roll style cast just like that and get as far back in there as you possibly can and just kind of reel it out. It's just like fishing like a swim jig under a dock or something along those lines, but you're going to want to make that roll just kind of to keep your bait kind of parallel with the water line, and then it just skips right across. The other cast you can make is kind of like a, what would you call it, like a parallel cast. So instead of rolling, basically you go like this and you kind of use your rod tip and sort of keep that bait sort of running parallel to the water, and then it skips across. It's two different ways. It really varies. Most of the time you're just going to use that roll because it's kind of like an all encompassing deal. Sometimes I'll use that little more parallel cast when the docks are a little higher like this and I want to get way back in there, because it allows me to kind of throw along parallel to the water, kind of like that, but it allows me to make a cast and keep the bait above the water for the longest period of time, thus allowing the bait to get further back there. But it's just a steady kind of pulsated retrieve. Watch where your shade lines are. That's very important because bass are going to use this. It's the mid of the day, a lot of sun. They like that ambush point, that low light kind of situation. That's why you catch them when the sun is setting. But just get it back in there. Get as far back in. Look for brush. Look for anything that makes a dock or like a shade area a little bit different. And the bass are going to be living there. So that gives you the basics on how to make the presentation. You're looking for those shade lines, you're looking for those darker areas. This fish like that low light. But let's talk about setups, baits, and presentations in order to do this, because you need to tweak your presentations and tweak your setups in order to do it efficiently. And that's what this game's all about. It's about covering water, covering docks, finding that sweet spot and catching those bass. So basically, I do it with a couple different chatterbaits. The big key with all of them is they're a little lighter than what you'd expect. It's a lot easier to skip, say, a 3/8 ounce chatterbait than it is a 1/2 ounce. Not saying you can't do it with a 1/2 ounce, but since these fish are shallow, oftentimes these docks are in shallower water, that 3/8 allows you to sort of glide that bait further back inside the dock, which is usually where those bigger ones live, and it's just a little bit more manageable. You'll find you're going to rat's nest and backlash no matter what. Nobody's perfect. It's just going to be a part of the process when you're skipping these docks, but you'll find by using a 3/8 ounce or even lighter chatterbait, you're not going to do it as much. The other key here is I do it with two different chatterbaits. One is this new Chatterbait Mini. It's a smaller presentation, it's a little more compact, it's a little easier to slide back there, but then I'll also do it with your standard 3/8 ounce jackhammer. So those are kind of my two chatterbaits that I'll use. You'll notice that I got all this stuff in red because spring, red, it works. Don't know why, but it catches them. The other thing that you want to keep in mind with this presentation, is I got a little bit of grass on there, I like something that's a little more streamlined. So this is actually a little easy, but I've cut the tail off just like that. Other things like that, maybe like a zoom, fluke, just with that straight tail, super, you know, streamlined presentation. I prefer baits that have more of a straight presentation versus the flappers. What I've found is when you're skipping that bait, if you have those little flapping appendages on it, it catches water as you're skipping the bait, and it causes the bait to kind of foul as it's skipping back there, creating shorter skips. Basically, you can't get as far back in the cover. So I lean more towards like streamlined presentations. Another example would be, you've seen this guy in the videos quite a few times. It's that spunk shad, things that have pretty much straight tails. Now, in that same vein, another thing that you need to focus on is your rod. Your rod is probably, aside from the weight of the chatterbait, your rod is probably one of the most important components in this presentation. I run a 7-foot medium heavy XD3. Now, the reason for that is when you're skipping, like you saw in that little explanation, you're making a lot of roll casts. So they're low to the water, kind of roll casts, very tight to the water. You don't have much space to operate. And oftentimes when you're fishing around these docks and around this wood, you don't have much space to operate in the first place. So that shorter rod allows you to be a little more, I guess, targeted. You're able to sort of put the bait on a dime on a very, very tight space. It also allows you to make that roll cast without actually slapping your bait in the water, which leads to a bunch of backlashes. You need to judge the rod based upon your height. I'm about 5'8", 5'9", so that 7 foot is perfect. If you're a little shorter, look at a 6'10". If you're a little taller, maybe a 7'1", 7'2". You kind of play in that range. You want a rod that's very manageable, but a little bit shorter maybe than what you're used to using, or shorter than your dragging worm presentation. I run 15-pound fluorocarbon for the most part. I would not go any lighter than that. Usually 17 to 20 is probably a little better deal, but what you'll find is with lighter line, like that 15, it's a lot easier to skip. The heavier line tends to get those curls and those sort of coils in it, and it makes it a little harder to skip because you want that line to kind of free flow as you're skipping the bait, and the lighter line free flows a lot better, so you're able to skip that bait further back. I run a 7.2 Shimano SLX. You could even run something faster if you wanted to. I wouldn't recommend anything slower. A lot of times we'll do that roll cast and some extra line will shoot out, so before you even like pick up on the bait, you got to reel up that extra line, or a fish bites it, grabs it, and runs to the left, and you got to pick up that slack line because the fish grabbed it so fast. 7.2 seems to be kind of that perfect, enough fastness but slow enough to present a bait with a blade on it like this, that sort of has kind of moving action like a spinnerbait or a crankbait or something like that without over reeling it. Oftentimes as we get later into spring, there's a lot more brim and things along those lines, so I'll use maybe a darker colored chatterbait. Right now it's tough to beat the red. The water's got a little stain in it. It kind of covers me for all bases, but usually if the water were a little bit clearer, I'd be throwing like a shad or a lighter colored bait. But as we get later in spring, those brim really show up, and it's tough to beat that darker chatterbait, whether it's green pumpkin, black and blue, all those dark sort of brim mimickers. One of the overarching themes in my videos is doing something the same but different, and skipping a chatterbait is exactly that. We know skipping a jig works. We know skipping in general works. There's a lot of baits that are sort of standards when it comes to that presentation, but a chatterbait they haven't seen so much, and I think a lot of guys, I know I was, are super surprised how easy it is to skip a chatterbait, because when it comes down to it, all that chatterbait is a jig head with a blade attached to it. And actually a lot of the Z-Man chatterbaits have kind of a flat bottom to them right there, making them super easy to skip. It's almost like an Arky style jig, you know. It's very easy to work with and skip under a dock. So if you haven't tried this technique, give it a try. If you got anything to add to the video, any kind of tips or technique tweaks, go ahead and drop them down in the comments box. I always love your information. You guys have a wealth of fishing knowledge, and I steal from it. I'll be totally honest, dude. I've tried a lot of the baits that you guys have mentioned and had a lot of success with them. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Grab a chatterbait, put it under a dock, catch a bass, because spring is coming, or it's here, or it's coming. Either way, you're gonna catch some bass doing this. So give it a try, hit that like and subscribe button. Thank you guys for the grassroots support. We'll see you back in the next video. Tight lines.